Hello and welcome to State of the Earth, the podcast from the Graduate School of Environment and Sustainability at the University of Exeter. I'm Daniel, an MSc student studying Marine Environmental Management. Today, I'm interviewing Professor Clare Saunders, who is Professor of Environmental Politics at the Environment and Sustainability Institute. Clare's research focuses on social movements and protest, as well as the politics of climate and energy. She has been based at the University of Exeter since 2013. Thank you so much for joining me, Clare.
Thank you. It's nice to be here.
So to start off with, what is the role of protest and activism in the development of social, economic, and environmental policy?
It's a very complex role. So when people first started looking at the impacts of social movements in general, they were thinking mainly, this is in political science, they were mainly thinking of social movements as things that tried to influence policy and that tried to influence policy directly. And over the years, we've realised that that's a very simplistic way of thinking about the impacts that social movements have. Although they may influence policy, they can often do so in very indirect ways. So one of the obvious ways in which social movements influence policy is by influencing the media, and also by influencing the opinions of people. And often when a public issue has a lot of salience, which is to say that it's in the media a lot, it's discussed a lot, it's contested a lot, as an electoral issue, when an issue is really popular like that and salient, that's when you tend to get policy change. So we're talking about direct and indirect changes. But of course, social movements are doing, environmental movements are doing much, much more than just trying to get policies in. I mean, the environmental movement was partly responsible in the UK for the 2008 Climate Change Act, but obviously not a lot has happened in terms of making the extent of progress that we need to make in shifting our economy to a green economy. A lot of commentators are saying it's happening rather slowly. The social movements aren't just sitting back and thinking, oh, we got the policy through, therefore we're successful. They're working in a whole range of other ways, trying to influence businesses to change the way they do things, to try to influence people and their lifestyles, and actually providing kind of like havens where people can discuss different environmental visions. And those environmental visions are often seen as quite radical by policymakers, but at the same time, they're very, very deeply informed by science. So it's quite complicated, the ways in which social movements affect policy, both directly and indirectly.
I suppose anything in politics and related to politics will be very complex and tangled, I suppose.
That's
Um,
why I think that's why we all love studying politics. It never gets boring.
Boring is certainly not a word you'd use to describe, I suppose, the last few years in politics, particularly. So you mentioned the whole sort of shaping the media narrative there. How do media organizations shape our perceptions of the protests and the social movements themselves, and also the issues that they relate to?
That's really interesting to have a think about how the media cover protests. So it depends on a number of things. It depends on the nature of the protest. It depends on the claims of the protest. It depends on whether the media have even noticed that the protest is there. There may be other things competing for the media agenda. And it's so interesting that a number of years ago, my goodness, I must have been quite a junior researcher. It must have been in the early 2000s. I went to Edinburgh for the Make Poverty History demonstrations, huge demonstrations in Edinburgh. And I went to the like autonomous radical activist space where there was this little display about how radical activists had been presented in the media as if they were kind of like folk devils and terrorists. And it was really interesting to hear some of the activists talking themselves about how they'd been miscaricatured by the media. It's particularly the sort of more populist, right-wing tabloid media that takes the slant of thinking of activists as eco-terrorists. Quite often, the Guardian and the Independent have specialist green columns where they focus more on the causes that activists are pushing for rather than on the forms of action. But I think that the forms of action taken by Just Stop Oil have attracted a lot of negative media attention because throwing orange paint at a treasured cultural artifact in an art museum, I think distracts the public a tiny bit away from the climate cause. and the media presents it as damage to cultural artifacts, and the issue of climate change gets sidelined or sidetracked. So like I said, it depends on which media sources you're looking at and the nature of the protest, and also the competition for other issues on the media agenda at the time.
Yes, you touched there on the opinions of the tabloid media, and particularly the more right wing, or at least right leaning media towards environmental activism and protest. How, if at all, has the portrayal in possibly those specific types of media, the portrayal of climate change and environmental protests in the UK changed over time, and has that impacted how climate change and environmental issues are seen by the UK public?
Yeah, sure. So I think the media plays a really important role in setting the agenda. It's been some time now since I did a piece of research that was looking at coverage of climate change across time and comparing the tabloid papers to the quality press. And what we were seeing then when we did that analysis, I think we went up until about 2017 in the analysis. So the last few years aren't included in that paper. It's published in Geoforum. It's called something like Attention to Climate Change in the British Media. What you see is it's quite interesting that when there's some kind of big event, perhaps like huge wildfires, or for example, back in 2004, Al Gore with his film The Inconvenient Truth, when something big happens like that, that forms a sort of trigger for the media. And so you get a kind of peak in media coverage, and then there won't be a significant event for some time, and then there'll be a decline in the coverage, and then there'll be another peak later on. Quite often those peaks will also happen around the time of major climate change demonstrations, but it's hard to know if it's the demonstrations that are causing the media signal to increase. Probably what's happening is that the big climate change demonstrations tend to happen around the same time as the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change conferences. So it's a kind of conflation of things that cause a peak or a trough in media coverage. Only yesterday I was looking at trend lines for the public's concern about the climate. I think the question, no, actually, it was about the environment more broadly. So the question that's asked by YouGov is something like, what do you consider to be the most important problem in your country? And obviously that's the UK for us. And I was looking to see whether the Extinction Rebellion demonstrations in 2019 and in 2023 had much of an effect on the salience of the public concern for the environment. And actually, at both points in time, it looked to me like around 22% of the public put the environment as the most important issue. Since then, it's gone up slightly. Of course, it's quite difficult to infer why that's the case. But we are seeing, I think, increasingly alarming reports in from the IPCC that are reported about in the media that may be leading to this increase in public concern. So I think it's gone up to about 35% from 22% at its peak. So it's still not, the environment's still not seen as the most important issue, even when there is a lot more coverage of the science of climate change. The problem is that the question asks for the most important problem. So it's not like, here's a list of problems on a scale of 1 to 5, how important do you think they are? If we ask that question in surveys, then probably loads more people would rate climate change really highly. But it's a kind of artifact of the way the question's asked. So the things people usually say are the most important issues are economy, housing, immigration, the kind of bread and butter issues, because they're forced to pick one. But if they could just answer on a 1 to 5, how concerned are you about these issues, then probably climate would look a lot more significant in public salience. So it's just a little interesting quirk of how we measure things in social science and why that makes a difference to what we think we know.
As ever, I suppose methodology and framing and the research methods are very important to all
Sure.
of this. So you mentioned that paper that you published a few years ago looking at media attention on sort of climate change and the environment in the UK. And you noted one of the findings from that was that there were spikes in media attention around sort of major climate disasters. Has the media started to mention climate change in relation to natural disasters more over the years? Is that a trend that you've noticed?
Yeah, so I think that what's happened over the last 10 years is that, say 10 years ago there would be a major catastrophe like a wildfire or something, and people would say, well, we always have these, but over time what we've seen is that journalists are now connecting it to climate change, because scientific experts are saying that we can expect to have more of these rare events, and they're less rare now precisely because of climate change. So yeah, there's definitely been some linking of disastrous weather to climate change in the media as well as in the scientific discourse, I would say.
Yeah, it's helping to counter, I suppose, that shifting baseline of assuming that what we have now is normal when that isn't necessarily the case.
Yeah.
So moving away from that a little bit, still in the realm of media, I think often, particularly in the tabloid press, we're sold maybe a caricature of the sort of person who participates in a protest. How would you characterize the demographics of protest on sort of recent hot button issues like austerity and climate change, maybe even some of the international issues that are going on with conflicts around the world?
Yeah, okay. So I think what happens is that the characteristics of protesters does vary across issues. I can talk most authoritatively about climate change protesters because I've done lots of recent survey research on who those people are, but have previously, say 10 years ago plus now, also done some survey research on other types of protesters as well. But in general, so it's interesting, like when Boris Johnson was Prime Minister, he was saying that the people who go to Extinction Rebellion protests, I probably misquote him here, but he said something like the hemp smelling, bivouac dwelling dropouts or idealists or something like that, something that was a bit disparaging. And we did a survey of the people who were at the 2019 Extinction Rebellion protests, and we discovered that more than 2/3 of them were from a middle class background. And the more recent work I've done suggests that they have quite a high average income. They're mostly white. They are exceedingly highly educated. Around 85% of them have a degree or are doing a degree. And over 1/3 of them have a higher qualification like a master's or a PhD. So the caricature that Boris Johnson was making was entirely inappropriate for environmental demonstrators. And one of the things that the environmental movement's been trying to do is to reach out beyond that kind of white middle class demographic so that it can be more inclusive of people from a range of different backgrounds, but particularly people from racial minority backgrounds. And anecdotally, we thought that there were quite a few more people with an ethnic background, a racially diverse background, on the demonstration that Extinction Rebellion held in 2023, April 2023. So it was a moderate set of protest marches and pickets outside government departments. And Extinction Rebellion purposefully made this demonstration tame to help broaden the movement, but also I think perhaps in the background it was concerned about the 2023 Public Order Act, which makes it more possible to be arrested and charged for being a nuisance on a protest. So it purposefully tried to moderate its tactics. And we noted significantly fewer people from racially diverse backgrounds in the 2019 demonstrations, which was when activists in April and October 2019, the activists were trying to close down the centre of London to make a point to force policymakers to take climate change seriously. It was an irresistible event. And one of the criticisms of that form of action is that why would somebody from a background where they're disproportionately asked for stop and search, under stop and search powers, why would they want to get involved in something that puts them even more in the scrutiny of police officers and get themselves arrested. So you could see why more people of colour may be more willing to attend something where the risk of arrest is significantly lower. And then just recently, in June 2022, there was another big protest in London. I would estimate around 30,000 people went to it. It was called Restore Nature. So it moved away from climate change to focusing on a broader coalition for biodiversity. What's interesting there is that we see the number of ethnic minorities drops off again. And perhaps that's because there's something about nature that's decidedly white and decidedly more middle class than about the issue of climate change more generally. So you could see climate change quite easily as a sort of intersectional issue, whereas traditionally in the UK, nature conservation has been kind of like partnered up with all sorts of ideologies, including capital C Conservative Party conservatism. And perhaps that's alienated some people from the environmental movement again. But still, overall, very white, very middle class, exceedingly highly educated. Now, we could compare that to the types of people who were going on anti-austerity demonstrations and May Day demonstrations. And this is from data that's quite a little bit older. Those demonstrators tend to be from a broader variety of backgrounds than they do on the environment. And one of the arguments is that the environment attracts people from middle class and highly educated and wealthy backgrounds because the environment is a post-materialist concern and something that you focus on once your bread and butter issues are all settled. So, you know, once you've got a job and once you can think about higher level needs around the environment. So that's one of the reasons why people suggest that environmental concern on the streets manifests itself as this kind of elite white phenomenon. I think that's a bit out of date, and I'm trying to get people to think about the environment in different ways, because I think environmentalism is not a post-materialist concern. It's actually a fundamentally materialist concern, because we need the planet we live on before we can even think about the jobs and all of the other supposedly materialist issues. You need the environment first. So yeah, it's kind of interesting that the profile of activists varies across issues, but also across countries as well. We notice some significant differences. The protesters, from my memory, the Spanish protesters seem to be a lot angrier. They seem to be a bit younger, and they were generally a lot more left-wing than the protesters in Britain as well. So yeah, interesting differences across countries as well as across issues there.
Yeah, I suppose there's always going to be variation depending on perhaps what the culture of each country or even region might be. So you kind of there are a couple of questions that I wanted to ask you in relation to this, and you've sort of touched on both of them simultaneously. So this is going to be I suppose quite a broad question. It's kind of a chicken and the egg scenario. Would you say that the demographics of a protest or activist group shapes the methods that they use, or is it that the methods used by protest groups shape the demographics of people who get involved in protest, or is it a mixture of both?
Oh yeah, that's a really interesting one. I think that the demographics of the organizers are always going to shape the way that the protest is defined and set out in the first place. And then I think the sort of like mobilization opportunities, if you want to call them that, so like, you know, whether somebody feels it's okay to attend or whether someone's heard about it, a lot of that is a little bit class based, I would guess, to an extent. And yeah, I mean, why would you go to a demonstration where you're likely to get arrested if you've already been stopped and searched unfairly? So there's issues around race and class as well. I think some environmental movements purposefully try to mobilize. For example, there's some queer environmental groups, there's like the Black Environmental Network, there's Asian environmental groups, specifically geared up to attract those minority groups, and therefore they do attract those minority groups. So I think it's a bit of both. And it's also bringing to my mind some of the literature on why people participate in protest in the first place. So there's an argument that people who participate in protest can be what's called biographically available, which means they're not like me working all the time. They've actually got some time or space to manage their calendars and their diaries so that they can go on protest. But also they're structurally available, which means that they have friendship networks and groups that pull them into the protest. It's found time and time again that if somebody asks you to attend a protest, you're more likely to do it than if they don't ask you to attend a protest. So, you know, if the organising committee are all white middle class people and they're asking all their friends and all their friends are asking their friends, then that kind of profile replicates itself. So yeah, I think you're right. I think it works both ways. I think sometimes the demographics shape the protest, but then the nature of the protest will also shape the demographics of who turns out on the day for all of those reasons.
Yeah, I suppose it's, as with anything that's sort of chicken and the egg framing, it's quite hard to give a definitive answer.
I think we would say in social science it's iterative and interactional.
Yeah, so thank you for that. So I suppose still on the sort of the demography of protest and social movement, you touched on how the more recent Extinction Rebellion and other protests have sought to be tamer, as you said, and potentially were more inclusive to activists, particularly from ethnic minority groups, but also working class activists. Is environmental activism becoming progressively more inclusive to people from working class and ethnic minority backgrounds, or was this sort of an aberration?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, the survey evidence is difficult to use to qualify or discount the idea that the movement's becoming more inclusive, because movements are framed in different ways or have different action repertoires. So, I mean, if we had, say, exactly the same kind of action, exactly the same messaging, same mobilizing organizations, etc., organizing every year on year, you could compare the demographics and say it's becoming more or less inclusive. But actually stuff changes, the political context changes, the groups organizing the demonstrations change, so the whole mobilizing setup is different, the actions are different, and therefore you can't really make that comparison over time to say if it's becoming more or less inclusive. It's an ambition for the environmental movement to make itself as inclusive as possible. And I do know that there are now a significant number of new organizations that never used to exist that are specifically set up to reach minorities. So, you know, there are, as I said before, there are some queer groups, there are some Asian groups, there are some Black groups, there are young people's groups. I mean, that's something I should talk about a tiny bit more. And I think you might want to talk to me about that anyway, about the global climate strikes. I mean, definitely more inclusive of young people. Some of the first climate demonstrations I went to, maybe it's just because I've got old and I've been studying this for 20 years, actually. But I didn't notice so many young people by any stretch of the imagination. So I think we've definitely got a wider range of generations participating in climate protests. So we're definitely more inclusive in that sense. So you will see a significant proportion of people who are retired, who are protesting to protect their children and their children's children and their great-grandchildren. You see parents, but you also see a significant cohort now of students engaging in climate protest as well.
Yeah, so I was going to come on to youth activism, I suppose next. So obviously we have seen the school strikes from Fridays for Future and other youth-led and youth-organized climate activism. I suppose probably from 2017, 2018, it really gained salience. Has there been a lasting impact from that on the climate movement and on policy debates and the development of solutions to climate change?
Yeah, so I think it's been absolutely incredible, the amount of youth activism that's been going on. And one of the things that I found quite astonishing was the voice that Greta Thunberg's had in the policy making process. So she's been invited to talk to EU leaders. She's been invited to talk at United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change meetings. She's had a seat at a number of tables where even your kind of like seasoned Friends of the Earth activists might not get in. And that's really like made people listen to young people. She's had a profound effect on a significant generation of people. And I remember thinking, wow, this is novel and this is unique. And then I started looking into it. And the Rio conference, the Rio, what was it called? The Earth Summit conference would have been in 1992. Apparently they had young activists talking there as well. So it's not as new as I thought it was. And the reason we all think it's new and novel is because the voices of young people are now getting massively amplified by social media. So you say, is this having a lasting impact? Massive impact on the media. I think perhaps young people are getting invited more to big conferences than they were. I think it's also having a significant impact on the environmental movement itself, that is now trying to make sure that it includes young people. There have been some critiques of environmental activism as being what's called adultist, which means just sort of like adults taking control of things, and in its worst variant it could mean kind of like ignoring young people and just assuming that they're naive and they don't know what they're talking about and they don't have real political agency. And those critiques, I think, have hit the environmental movement hard, and people have been trying to find ways now to build long-lasting cross-generational alliances. I mean, like, the worst thing that could happen from a new wave of climate activists is that the youngsters turn around and say, oh, you didn't save us, and then the older people going like, well, you're naive, what do you know? That kind of like conflict between generations is the last thing that anybody needs in this sort of situation. I think the older generations have worked really hard, older climate activist generations have worked really hard to try and stop us being in the situation we're in now, and that there are a lot of hard lessons that can be learned and shared. And I think the movement's beginning to do that. And I think it's also having an effect on academic writing as well. I've recently been involved in writing a chapter for a new academic handbook on climate change activism. And one of the co-editors, his name's Benjamin Bowman, he really strongly advocates for us writing with young climate change activists, so that we're not, I'm not just this kind of like nearly 50-year-old woman who's got out of touch with the youth anymore. I've tried to work with a young climate activist. In fact, I worked with Holly Assel and Tristan Herbert, both activists, young activists in Falmouth, and we've written a chapter about the extent to which activism could be seen as adultist and how you might move beyond this to generate rich and useful cross-generational alliances that are really powerful for helping deal with climate change. I don't know what's happened in terms of mobilization of young people in climate strikes. I know things have gone quiet, especially in Cornwall, around the climate strikes. And my sense is that, you say, have they had an enduring impact? Well, they will have done in terms of setting a new discursive agenda, but in terms of like our young people carrying on with climate change protests, I think a lot happened in the interim. We had COVID, it disrupted education, and I think I could understand why students and school pupils would be unwilling to jeopardize an already quite messed up education. So yes, I think that's shifted some of their terms around, oh, do I want to skip school on Friday to protest against climate change? Ooh, maybe not, but I think a lot of young people are thinking seriously about how to create really green environmental lifestyles. So although you might not see the impact in terms of more and more climate strikes occurring across the UK, you'll definitely see loads of young people thinking carefully about what they eat, what they wear, how they travel, etc. There was a good climate strike demonstration in Falmouth at the time of the G8 demonstrations that happened in Cornwall in 2021. People turned out to protest despite COVID, wearing masks and socially distanced. In fact, on my computer here, I have a photograph that my husband took of 3 young activists holding a banner that says, "Stop the meltdown." They're socially distanced and they're wearing masks. So, you know, when the right set of political opportunities comes about for a protest of that nature, I think young people still are doing it.
So going on from what you said there about youth involvement in activism, what is the value of young people being in activist spaces? Why is it important or necessary for the environmental movement to have youth inclusion?
So youth inclusion is really important because young people will be disproportionately affected by the climate change by all the greenhouse gas emissions that have been accumulated by older generations. There's the younger people that will feel the worst brunt of the future. So I think Greta Thunberg herself says something like, "You're stealing our future. How dare you?" You know, she gets very indignant about it. So there's that reason, you know, disproportionately affected. But there's also really long-standing political and scholarly debates around getting young people involved in politics, because traditionally young people, when they turn 18, they're a bit more skeptical to vote and a bit more skeptical about active citizenship. So getting them involved in climate activism is also, I think, really important for setting them up as future citizens, to learn that, you know, even if they don't feel they're making a policy difference, to feel that power that you get when you come together with other groups of people and engage in collective action for something you believe in. Really important.
Yeah, certainly sounds it. Thank you so much for talking with me today, Claire. I really appreciate you finding the time. So if you'd like to find out more about the research that's being done at the University of Exeter, please go and have a look at our social media accounts. You can find us by searching for the Graduate School of Environment and Sustainability on Instagram, Twitter, Blue Sky, and LinkedIn. And you can also hear more from the State of the Earth podcast on Spotify and many other platforms. Thank you very much, and see you next time.